Robert Adams was slowly walking down the hallway, trying not to think about the fact that he was inside the state penitentiary. The unknown frightened him and made him flinch with every step of the guard. Deep down, Mr. Adams had long known that he'd have to serve a long sentence and that his lawyer wouldn't be able to help him. It just so happened that he received this sentence for virtually nothing. Sure, he was guilty to some extent, but that definitely wasn't worth taking the case to trial. "Well, old man, are you ready to taste the prison life in your old age? Is that what you wanted?" the guard asked in a rather friendly manner. Mr. Adams shrugged, indicating that he didn't want to answer that question. Soon, the guard led him to the cell door, then took a bunch of keys from his belt and inserted one of them into the lock. As soon as he did, the old man heard a creaking sound and the door opened. The guard stepped aside, giving the elderly inmate room to enter. Before leaving, he gave Mr. Adams a pat on the shoulder and advised him to keep his eyes wide open. No sooner than the door closed behind the old man, a towel was thrown under the old man's feet. Surprised, Mr. Adams froze and then looked down at the piece of light-colored cotton fabric with the prison emblem in the corner. Despite the fact that each inmate had one of those towels, throwing them on the floor still wasn't a good idea. Robert Adams was a tidy man, so without much hesitation, he picked up the towel. At that moment, the old man didn't even consider that he could do something so wrong and impulsive. Although Mr. Adams had already heard about the tests the fellow inmates had all the newcomers go through. Mentally, the old man prepared himself for a verbal dispute or even a fight, but he never expected the towel test. Unfortunately, Mr. Adams didn't know that picking that towel up was a bad idea. It was thrown down with a specific purpose to provoke the unsuspecting newcomer into a hasty decision. And Mr. Adams fell for it. Still holding the ill-fated towel in his hand, the elderly man went further into the cell. It was stuffy inside. There was also a strong smell of tobacco and something else that made Mr. Adams feel nauseous. "Hey, old man, why did you freeze there? Come in, take a seat, but throw away the rag," said one of the inmates, who held unquestionable authority within that particular cell. The old man did not want to throw away the towel, thinking that it could be useful. Having tossed the towel onto one of the empty beds, he approached the table where at least a dozen inmates were seated. Most of them were hardened criminals with personal files of at least a couple of inches thick. The inmates were drinking tea, passing around the cup of a strong brew. "Well, old man, spill the beans. What landed you here? How did you plan to survive? And to make the conversation go smoother, have some tea," the inmate said, passing the cup to the newcomer. Still unaware of the catch, Mr. Adams took the cup from the inmate's hands and took a couple of sips. The strong, scalding drink made the old man shudder and grimace. The inmates immediately burst into laughter, reminding him of a pack of hyenas celebrating a successful lion hunt. Recalling the question asked by his fellow inmates, the old man honestly replied, "I ended up here by accident. Apparently, I sold a weapon to my neighbor, not a firearm, but a cold weapon. It was meant as a gift, but he gave me money for it. A minute later, the police stormed into my house with the search warrant. They immediately confiscated the money marked with the special paint. I had no bad intention. I honestly just wanted it to be a gift." The inmates exchanged meaningful glances. The old man's story sounded highly implausible, and they didn't think he was telling the truth, especially considered that he was convicted of arms dealing. You probably don't know this, but arms dealers like you don't get much respect in our cell, so you'll be sleeping near the door. See that bed over there? The inmate said sternly. Mr. Adams looked sadly in the direction indicated and nodded. The problem was that the designated bed was opposite the toilet area, which automatically downgraded the status of its owner in the prison hierarchy. On the other hand, he had no other choice. He realized that he had made a mistake with that fateful towel. An experienced inmate would have wiped his feet on the towel, stepped over it, and entered the cell nonchalantly. It was an old prison trick aimed at revealing the person's weaknesses. If you picked up the towel, it meant that you lacked willpower and didn't deserve respect from the other inmates. Mr. Adams tossed and turned on the uncomfortable bed throughout the night, having a hard time falling asleep. Unfortunately, he only managed to doze off an hour before the morning wake-up call established by the prison's internal regulations. The morning turned out to be harsh. The inmates had already made up their minds and assigned Mr. Adams to be the outcast, tasked with cleaning the floors and tidying up the premises. Of course, the old man saw nothing shameful in it. After all, if you don't keep the premises clean, it can lead to the spread of infections, and that could be a serious problem. Mr. Adams understood it better than anyone else. Understanding that he was in a rather precarious situation, the old man didn't argue with his cellmates and simply did everything they told him to do. However, Mr. Adams didn't grovel or ask for leniency. He knew that he should have tried harder to stay out of prison, but having ended up in there, he had to live with its unwritten rules. The day had just begun, but Mr. Adams was already exhausted, having mopped the floors in the hallways and on the toilet area. It usually took at least 2 inmates to perform this task, but no one felt like helping the newcomer. At some point, Mr. Adams felt so sad that tears welled up in his eyes. Why did I give him that knife? That's some neighbor I got. He must have set me up. And all I did was out of the kindness of my heart, and it was a great knife, too. Buffalo leather sheath inlays, the old man thought with regret. The inmates looked at the elderly man with disdain, watching him wake the mop like a sailor on a ship's deck. In their understanding, justice had prevailed, and the arms dealer had gotten what he deserved. Unwilling to try to figure out all the details of his situation, they branded Mr. Adams as an outcast, not worthy of the time of the other inmates. Never before had the man felt such shame. Mr. Adams had been through a lot in his life and always managed to maintain his composure in any situation. But now he was desperate. The prison lived by its own laws, and it was impossible to change anything. If only Mr. Adams could have known that his life would change for the better in just a few minutes. It all started with the arrival of the new prisoner in the cell. Actually, he had already been there before and enjoyed unquestionable authority among the inmates. He was a true prison wolf, well-versed in the procedural nuances and the prison customs. Nobody dared to throw a towel under his feet. They knew better. The prisoner's name was Simon Lopez, and he already had 4 convictions behind him. His word carried such weight in that prison that he sometimes helped resolve conflicts just like an arbitrator. Having learned the latest news from one of his buddies, Simon stopped and looked at the elderly man changing the water in his bucket. Suddenly, he realized that the old man's face seemed familiar. Simon knew that he had definitely seen him before. But where and under what circumstances? Having approached the old man, Simon shuddered and exclaimed, still unable to believe his eyes. "Mr. Adams, is that you? But how did you end up here?" The elderly man looked at Simon and then lowered his eyes in embarrassment. The inmates fell silent as if on cue, waiting for the continuation of this strange conversation. But what Simon did next shocked everyone. Having embraced Mr. Adams, the inmate publicly asked him for forgiveness. "What's going on with Simon? He must be out of his mind," someone said. But as it turned out later, Simon was perfectly sane. Few people knew that Robert Adams had dedicated about 40 years of his life to surgery, considering it the queen of medical sciences. It was now that he was a frail old retiree, but before, his portrait hung in the hospital hall, which was considered the highest manifestation of gratitude from the management. As fate would have it, a few years ago, Robert performed a complex operation on Simon's mother, a procedure no one else wanted to undertake. Mr. Adams saved the patient's life, earning respect in the eyes of her eldest son. While standing in his mother's hospital room, Simon vowed to repay the doctor's kindness one day. However, he only managed to fulfill his promise many years later when he met Robert Adams in prison. From that day on, the elderly surgeon no longer cleaned the floors. Now he was treated on equal terms with Simon, who decided to help him. Soon, through his connections on the outside, Simon got in touch with the lawyer, whose success rate approached 100%. After reviewing Robert Adams's case, the tenacious lawyer first managed to have it reviewed and then have the verdict completely overturned. The elderly surgeon left the prison amidst thunderous applause, and even the hardened guards couldn't hold back their smiles at the sight of this touching scene. Robert waved at Simon, then slowly walked down the hallway, leading to the coveted freedom.